tomorrow, voters in the French territory of New Caledonia will make a momentous decision. Do they stick with Paris or embrace independence after more than 150 years under French authority?
Now, the contest has exposed racial and economic fault lines, and while the polls predict a comfortable victory for those who want to stick with France, the final outcome remains uncertain. For more, our Pacific Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts joins us from New Caledonia with a spectacular backdrop there, Stephen. Now, Stephen, New Caledonia is only 1,500 kilometres from Australia's east coast, but Australians don't actually focus on it that much. So tell us, why are we having this vote tomorrow?
Oh, that's right, Joe. Look, the history to this vote is really pretty fraught and complex. As you mentioned, New Caledonia has been held by France since 1853, but ever since the 1960s, really, the Indigenous people here and their leaders, they're called the Kanaks, have been pushing and pressing for independence. They say that the principle of self-determination is vital, and they have their right to run their own affairs. Now, in the 1980s, that really almost tipped the country into civil war. There was a surge of violence, and it culminated in a fairly bloody siege on the island of Uvaea, right to the north of here, where about 24 policemen were taken hostage. French commandos then stormed the cave where they were being held and killed 19 Kanak militants. And it really looked like a war in some form, or at least serious strife would be coming. But the country really turned back from the brink after that. They entered into negotiations, and then in 1998 they struck an agreement called the Noumea Accord, and they basically agreed, the French state, to hand over more power to people here in New Caledonia and eventually give them a vote for independence. Now, that was 2 decades ago, and now finally, after a long wait, that moment's actually here. And on Sunday, now only 1 day away, voters in New Caledonia will go to the polls and they'll get to decide, do they stay with Paris or do they finally strike out as a fully independent country?
So tell us, Stephen, about the two sides. Generally speaking, why are people voting yes and why are people voting no?
Well, Joe, this is a bit of a simplification, but many of the people who are voting yes are Kanaks. They're from the Indigenous community, and many of the people who are voting no tend to be white New Caledonians, people from the European community here. There are exceptions to that, but that broad racial and ethnic dynamic, it does really come across pretty clearly. In terms of voting yes, it's really for the Kanak community a principle of freedom. They say they shouldn't have their affairs dictated by France, and they believe that they can strike a better deal, in particular for poorer people in this country, if they are entirely self-governing. The no vote, well, that's a little bit more complicated, but economic anxiety plays a big part of it, you'd have to say. At the moment, France pours a huge amount of money, about $1.5 billion every year into this territory. That means it's got a standard of living which is basically comparable to New Zealand's. That's unusual in the Pacific, and a lot of people here fear that if France does turn off that tap, if it does become independent, then that will have real consequences for their standard of living here.
So that's one ramification. What is the likely result, and what are the ramifications of either a yes or a no vote?
Well, the polls are saying that there's going to be a victory for the no vote, that it should be at least 60 to 40%, and most of the parties who've been campaigning here to stay are really confident. They say the vote could be as high as 70% in favour of sticking with France. Though it's not quite, I think, as straightforward as that. In some ways, there's a lot of uncertainty here because it really does depend on just how many younger voters in particular, and young voters in particular from the Indigenous community, come out to vote. They're normally politically fairly disengaged, but the Kanak community leaders here have been pressing them to come to the ballot box. If they show up in great numbers, then that may tip the balance potentially towards a closer result, even potentially a yes vote. Consequences? Well, if there's a yes vote, we get a new country. If there's a no vote, more likely, well, that's difficult. There's a risk that some leaders here in the loyalist forces will press for that to be the end of the matter. There are meant to be 3 votes under the Noumea Accords, but some leaders here who are in favour of sticking with France say, well, If there's one vote that's crushing defeat for the Yes campaign, that should be at the end of it. Now, that does pose a risk of reopening old wounds, and that could potentially stoke a resurgence of violence after 30 years of peace. So there are risks on both sides of the equations here.
All right, we'll wait and see how it plays out. Stephen Jurgetts, we'll leave it there. Thank you.